Hello and welcome to Restorative Justice, What Makes It Work? This webinar is part of the Washtenaw Intermediate School District's Restorative Justice series. In this session, we offer a brief introduction to the principles behind restorative justice in education in order to help you understand why it works better than traditional school discipline, which is usually exclusionary. In this webinar, we will do a quick review of the restorative justice philosophy. Then we'll introduce about 3 academic theories which help us understand why restorative justice has been working for generations. And then we will engage you in considering discipline through a restorative lens. I'm your trainer, Nancy Schertzing. I'm honored to share with you my expertise in practicing and coordinating restorative justice programs from the K-12 through the university levels, my experience training educators in how to apply and integrate the restorative justice philosophy into their learning communities, and I'm proud to have helped the Michigan Department of Education integrate restorative justice into the State Board of Ed policy on reducing suspensions and expulsions, the Model Code of Student Conduct, and an online training of more extensive and in-depth on restorative justice in education, all of which are available on the Michigan Department of Ed website. Zero tolerance has been the predominant disciplinary approach for most current educators' careers. And though we are seeing movement away from that approach, its reliance on suspension and expulsion have caused harm in ways that many never intended. Let's unpack some of the harm to individuals that this exclusionary discipline has caused. First thing that we know is that when a student is suspended, the likelihood of their repeating that grade doubles, and that's according to a 2014 report issued by the School Discipline Consensus Report. Also, we know that students suspended or expelled for a discretionary incident were nearly 3 times as likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system within the next year. That data comes from our Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. We also know that the U.S. death rate for people who have not completed high school is 2.5 times higher than those who have a high school degree and or some level of college education. This is a statistic we know all too well, but is something that's worth repeating. African American students without disabilities are more than 3 times as likely as equally abled white peers to be expelled or suspended from school. This statistic is so sobering. I want to really take a minute to have us focus on it. If we continue with our exclusionary practices and our criminalization of discipline in schools, 1/3 of African American boys born since 2000 are on track to be incarcerated. That comes from Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. I want to underscore and hope that you will join me in the hearing the clarion call that this statistic cannot be allowed to come true, that we have to do something different in our discipline processes, and I hope you will join me in that. This is a great first step. In addition to personal costs, zero tolerance's exclusionary discipline also imposes fiscal or financial costs. Consider, for example, that in 2016, the state of Michigan budgeted $98 million for secondary education, but they budgeted over $2 billion. Over $2 billion of our state tax dollars went into corrections, and that statistic comes from the Kaiser Family Foundation. We also know that with just a 1% increase in graduation rates, we could save $1.4 billion in incarceration costs. This is countrywide, not just for the state of Michigan, or about $2,100 for every male high school graduate. We also know that if literacy levels were, if we were able to raise our literacy levels to those of Sweden, for example, our GDP, gross domestic product for the United States, would rise by $463 billion. And tax revenues, of course, if our people are earning more money, then our tax revenues would go up as well. $162 billion more would go into our coffers. So those statistics come from the Alliance for Excellent Education. Some sobering statistics on the previous slide, but on this slide we want to point to some exciting news, some better news, happier news. Out in Colorado, where they've been using restorative justice for a number of years, Restorative Justice Colorado reported that definitely in schools that use restorative justice, they saw a decrease in suspension rates. That's pretty typical throughout the country in schools that adopt a restorative model for discipline. But in those same schools, they also saw a nearly 50% drop in absenteeism and a 60% decrease in tardiness. In Minnesota, where they use restorative justice in many, many schools, their Department of Education supports restorative justice heartily. This statistic shows, or this graph shows, that in 2012 we saw a significant gap between the access or the achievement between white students' test scores and minority student, non-white student test scores. In just 5 years, with both populations improving, we see a narrowing of that gap, which is very persistent in many, many schools. Now, I will tell you that I cannot claim that this is, and neither did the Department of Education claim that restorative justice was the cause of this, but restorative justice is definitely a factor that happens in Minnesota schools, and it's very widespread. So it's exciting, and it would be interesting to explore the link in more detail. Then out in Oakland, California, the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth has been integrating restorative justice into a number of schools. Specifically in middle schools that implemented restorative justice, they saw a 24% decrease in chronic absences. Very important to note, it's a decrease, not an increase in chronic absences. Also in high schools that implemented restorative justice, they had a 56% decline in high school dropout rates, and in 9th grade in high schools where restorative justice has been integrated, they saw scholastic reading inventory tests for 9th graders double in schools where restorative justice was integrated. So these are exciting and I think hopeful signs that I hope that that interest you and make you interested in learning more. So before we begin to unpack what exactly restorative justice is, we need to recognize some important truths that inform this philosophy and practices. I want to draw your attention in the slides that follow to the fact that we are citing our sources, and many of those sources and others appear in the WISD Restorative Justice webpage. So I encourage you to please learn a little bit more, visit the website, and hopefully continue your learning beyond this webinar. Restorative justice and restorative practices are centered around some core beliefs that I would like to share with you in the form of a centering exercise. I invite you now to sit comfortably and close your eyes as I gently take you through the 7 core assumptions which were developed by Kay Pranis and Carolyn Boyce Watson. They are 2 towering figures in the restorative justice in education movement. As I read, please breathe deeply, take deep breaths, and exhale gently as you take in this wisdom and these truths from these women. Our first core assumption is that the true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful. Our second core assumption says the world is profoundly interconnected. Our third core belief is that all human beings have a deep desire to be in good relationship. Belief number 4, all human beings have gifts and everyone is needed for what they bring. Belief number 5, everything we need to make positive change is already here. Belief number 6, human beings are holistic. And belief number 7, we need practices to build habits of living from the core self. I invite you to take one more great, deep, cleansing breath and let it out as we move to our next slide. Like our core assumptions, restorative philosophy and practices are timeless, and they've been central to the way many ancient cultures have operated through generations. Our circles practice, for example, was shared by indigenous people of the Americas, both First Nations and American Indian. The conferencing practice comes from Maori communities in the South Pacific, and Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have made powerful changes in South Africa and Rwanda. We have so much to learn and to thank them for. Though we can never repay the debt we owe these communities, one small step in it is to acknowledge that this webinar was developed on land taken from the Anishinaabe people, or the original peoples of the Great Lakes. Howard Zehr and other leaders of the modern restorative justice movement recognize that hurt happens when people live and work together. We all cause and experience harm, and the fact that we are interconnected creates an obligation to heal that harm or to clean up our messes. Zehr argues that it just makes sense. In fact, it makes more sense than relying on punishment or exclusion to change a child's behavior. By now, we recognize the costs of traditional discipline, which we outlined earlier, both to individuals and to our society. We've cited examples from states where restorative justice has been integrated into school cultures for years, and we understand the foundation on which restorative justice is built. So let's take a look at how restorative justice compares to our society's approach to traditional discipline and unpack what a restorative approach looks like. Easiest way for me to help you understand what restorative justice is to explain to you what it is not. Howard Zehr, a towering figure in the current restorative justice movement, explains the differences in very simply. He says that when someone has committed some infraction under the traditional discipline system, that person goes before an authority figure, and the authority figure wants to know what rules have been broken, who broke those rules, and what do they deserve. In a school setting, the person who's in authority is generally the dean of students or the principal, and the student would go before the principal. The principal, in answering the third question, what do they deserve, would look at whatever the infraction was and then go to the discipline rubric and see how many days suspension or what kind of a consequence is prescribed for that infraction. What Zehr and others invite us, however, to take that same situation but come at it from a different perspective. And instead of wanting to know what rule did you break, restorative justice is more interested in asking who has been hurt and what do they need. The third question, as Zare lays it out, is whose obligations are those to heal that hurt, to fulfill the needs that they have? Whose responsibility is it to make right or restore the relationship? This is a really important distinction between these two, and I hope that what you will understand from this example is that traditional discipline is very much focused on what rule did you break and what are the consequences, which is often punishment. You did the crime, you do the time, right? Whereas in a restorative setting, we are absolutely more focused on the harm and healing that harm. What do they need? That's how we define accountability in restorative justice, is how do we make things right? So we do this by engaging the people who have been affected, both the person who's been harmed, the person who caused the harm, and others in the community. We come together in a circle and we ask, the facilitator of the circle asks 3 basic questions. And these questions are also addressed in some of our other webinars. So bear with me if you've heard this before, but this is really an important thing to understand about how the restorative process works. So everyone who's affected is sitting together in circle. This might include the principal or the dean of students, but it doesn't necessarily involve that person. What restorative justice and a restorative practice does is it engages the people who have been directly affected, and together they ask the question, what happened? And every single person in that circle answers that question from their perspective. Once everyone in the circle has shared their answer to what happened, they are able to move on to the next question, which is who has been affected and how. Now, these questions, there may be other questions that we can ask within each of these different phases, but the bolded questions here kind of define the phase of the restorative process. When we ask the question, who has been affected and how, each person is invited to describe how they were affected and also to identify others that they know of who were affected by the incident and explain how they were affected. In this phase of the process, we really see empathy building, we hear storytelling. It helps us to identify where the harm is that we're going to be healing. Because the third phase of this process is kind of illustrated or defined by the question, how do we make things right as much as possible? What happens in this phase, again, each participant in turn offers ideas for what should be done to heal the harm or address the issue. And this phase is also a very important aspect of it, is that every single person in the circle must agree that each element, each suggestion either is something that they all agree to, or if even one person does not agree, then they go back to the drawing board and they continue to talk until they come up with some solutions for how do we make things right that every single person in the circle agrees on. It's a consensus-based process. The thing that you need to understand about restorative justice, which is so important and really fundamental to any practice of restorative justice, is that it is based on respect. I mentioned Howard Zare earlier. Zare, this is a quote from Howard Zare's Little Book of Restorative Justice, and he says quite simply, restorative justice is respect. respect for all. I can let you read that quote, and I will just talk with you just very briefly to mention that this has been such a cornerstone of my practice of restorative justice that I really hope that you will understand how vitally important the respect for every person's dignity is in making restorative justice a successful and a useful discipline tool. So here is how restorative justice is working in the Chicago public schools. This short video is produced by CPS, and it focuses mostly on a high school and a middle school setting, but you will see, I think, some pretty powerful examples of both using the restorative justice philosophy in discipline, but also I want you to pay attention to how this philosophy is touching and helping the students and the staff in the school as well.
When I was in Sullivan, freshman year, there was lots and lots of fights. I couldn't learn anything because it was like basically students in class would just, disturb the peace.
I had this really rough class where there was a lot more disrespect that I faced, just in terms of kids feeling like they could talk to an adult however they wanted to. Like there wasn't really a different way for them to speak to the adults in the building.
The kid that we're looking at now is somebody who likely sees trauma on a daily basis, is full of anxiety 99% of the time.
In the past, what has happened is either the student gets suspended, or it's usually they'll talk to the dean of students and they'll come back, but they'll come back really upset.
I would say the offender or the situation with that student, I would just say, well, you know what? I'm gonna look at the student code of conduct, you're getting suspended. That's it.
I believe that when you suspend the student, the only thing you're telling them is go home and have free time. That's the only thing that you're doing. When it comes to their classwork, you're making them fall behind.
How is that really gonna justify the student's change mentally, socially? How is it going to change in that aspect?
The punishment is so harsh and there's no conversations that go along with them. We don't teach them that. We don't teach them to take responsibility on what happened. We don't help them to reflect upon what happened or what they've done.
So you'd be the first one in your family to get a high school diploma, first one to graduate from Sullivan. We're 0 for 2 with your family. I want to be 1 for 3. And you're this close. Graduation is May 3rd.
When you talk of restorative justice and reduction of suspension, the biggest misconception is that when kids make mistakes and we don't suspend, we're letting them off the hook. That's their whole life, has been wrong someone and then run from it, wrong someone and not talk about it. I would tend to think that we are actually making them more on the hook.
You're not supposed to reward them by giving them free time. You should help them out and say, you know what, we're gonna keep you in school so you won't be behind.
There's a time for aggressive punishment when you jeopardize the safety of a building. But the greater majority of incidents that happen do not jeopardize the majority of the building.
I think the greatest change was in me. I began to see the same behaviors over and over again. And when I realized it, I said, something else is wrong if Johnny can't stop fighting. So then I reached out to our clinicians, our social workers and our counselor and our case manager, and I said, look at this. I need you to look at the behaviors that I'm seeing. Find out the trigger. What's triggering him to that point? And then once we found that out and I began to really look at it, it was time to stop talking about the problem and making a solution.
What we want to teach our students is to kind of navigate through that conflict, take some accountability, ownership of that, of when you do harm, and really learn the skill of reflecting on it.
When we have the restorative conversations with the students, when we can talk one-on-one and share our feelings, like, this is how I feel right now, this is how you affected my teaching, this is how this impacted everybody else, how do you feel about this? Or what would you do if you were me?
And suddenly now they're confronting it in the moment, being present on what really happened, rather than making up excuses or rationalizing it away, blaming someone else for it. So we do a lot of peer-to-peer conversations and teaching them how to talk to each other, and then we also do conflict resolution, a lot of that. We've also established more of a culture of respect and a culture of positive interactions. We're really stressing positive relationships.
It's adults in this building that will give you a different point of view. Most of the time, it prevents things from happening.
When they start seeing other people, faculty and staff members, generally caring about them, not just, hey, how you doing? but actually, how are you?
Other faculty members here, they want us to graduate on time.
This year has been really, really good. The hallway's peaceful. You have students in class.
Grades went up, scores went up, NWA went up. We shown growth.
It's like everybody's trying to learn right now. Everybody's trying to pass and trying to learn something.
All the other teachers here, they are very supportive. They really want you to do the right thing when it comes to education, and like they want you to have a really good life. They don't want you out in the street.
When I began to really assess the communities where they're coming out of and what's going on with them at home, then we wanted this to be their safe haven.
If I need help on something, I can go to one of the teachers, the staff. They make you feel like you're a family to them. You mean something to them, you're very special.
We actually listen, we talk to, we mentor, we give and help develop skills to students that might not have necessarily had them. Some of the students look at us as fathers, mothers, mentors.
And that's the difference, the concern, the compassion, the love, and that's called real love that they're giving them.
And what I want to see is less students giving up and more students making the decision and the choice to be somebody positive in our community.
I hope you enjoyed that video as much as I do. It's always such a rewarding experience for me to hear people talking in their own words and from their own experience about how restorative justice has helped them in become better learners, become better educators, and help develop a community as we're developing young lives. So why does it work? The question is one that there's not one simple answer. Restorative justice, as we mentioned, comes from ancient practices that have been passed down from generations. And so there's no one academic theory of restorative justice. But I do have some academic theories, which you may recognize, which help us to understand from people who have studied human behavior for many years and who kind of have observed some elements about how we as humans work that can help us really see the power of this process and how we might be able to put it to work for us and for our students in our learning communities. The theories come from a variety of different disciplines, and I am only presenting 3 in this webinar in the interest of time, and these are very cursory examples or very cursory examinations of them. It is not the entire list, and as restorative justice becomes more integrated into mainstream society, we are seeing more and more scholars that are applying different academic theories also. It's just an exciting time in our society. The first theory that we're going to look at is Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, which I'm pretty sure will be familiar to many of you. What Maslow, who studied many people, recognized and is trying to explain to us is that in order for us to achieve any of our higher levels of development, we have to understand that our physiological needs are absolutely the foundation for all of our learning, all of our development. If we do not have food and water and sleep, a place to be able to take care of our bodily functions, we are not ever going to be able to move up into these higher levels of development. And the point that I want to make for you is that, as we know, we realized during COVID-19, your students, many of them, come to rely on you and to associate school as a place where they can get food, where they can get water, where they can be able to feel safe. They have a safe environment where they can feel secure in their body and in their resources, their health, their property. Love and belonging is the next kind of level at which Maslow says we need to pay attention if we're going to be able to achieve higher levels, having friendship, feeling a sense of family, feeling a sense of community are definitely elements that we saw in our Chicago Public Schools video. So in order to help your students achieve these higher levels of development, we need to realize our role and the power that we play in our kids' lives by recognizing that they're associating us with these very foundational needs that we all experience as individuals. Another theory that is worth examining here, Travis Hershey is a sociologist. He was actually, I believe, a criminologist who had kind of looked at the situation from a different perspective. Hershey wanted to know, why do most people do the right thing most of the time? And if we think about our schools, our society, thank goodness, we recognize that most people do a really good job of following the rules and behaving in ways that we need them to behave. Hershey was wondering, why is that? What is the incentive that makes people conform to the way that they were socialized? And he comes up with this statement. He says that most people conform to socialization and social bonds because their relationships to others are essential to their survival in the community. Another way of saying this is that we rely on people, our parents, our teachers, our individuals who provide for us those basic needs that we just recognized in Maslow's hierarchy. And so because we rely on them, we recognize as individuals, it's in our best interest to honor those social bonds by behaving in the way that they are socializing us. Now, what is important for me to stress to you here is that they are not behaving, they're not honoring the social bonds that Nancy Schertzing establishes for them, or even maybe a teacher establishes for them. I don't know how many times you have had a child say to you, I had to hit him because my dad says that if somebody comes at me, I have to hit him back. That is an example of this control theory. That child has to rely on that parent and the socialization that that parent has given them in order to survive. And yet, if you as an educator, as a member of the learning community, can create a relationship with that student so that that student recognizes that you also are an essential part of their survival, then you have the ability to say that may be how you behave outside of school. But here in school, we need to behave in the way that, whatever way that you describe for that child. What Hershey is telling us here is that if we have those relationships, again, that word relationships, if we have those relationships and our students recognize that they rely on us for basic needs for their survival, then it is much easier for them to be able to conform to the rules that we are establishing for them. Our third theory that we're going to look at here is Glasser's choice theory. And if you've come up through education, then you probably understand this theory better than many people. So this very cursory examination tells us that what Glasser espoused or Glasser said after observing numerous students is that students will choose to learn from people whom they trust, whom they see as meeting their needs. If you've ever been in a classroom or you've ever taught adults in a training, you recognize that it's not just students who choose whether they're going to learn from someone or not. I'm very grateful to you for being here in this webinar, but I also recognize and honor that at any moment you have the choice and the option of tuning me out. So what Glasser says, and what I try to do as much as possible as this video allows us, is he says that people will choose to learn from adults who meet their needs, including survival. We've talked about Maslow's theory, freedom, fun, recognition and respect that goes with power, and love. I hope that you saw in that Chicago Public Schools video examples of every single one of those needs that we saw and that the Chicago Public Schools have really tried to integrate as part of their restorative justice practice. So bringing it all together, I want to kind of engage you in a little exercise here of putting these theories into practice. We have here what's called the social discipline window. It's offered or provided to us by the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And this is just a short video in which I will explain to you how this social discipline window works. When you think about discipline, if you consider it as a function of control and support, it can help you adjust and kind of take the mystery out of discipline and the whole process of it. Sometimes it's a little, we feel like we can either do discipline well or we don't do discipline well. Thinking about it as a function of control and support, the International Institute for Restorative Practices has put together what they call the social discipline window. And this social discipline window is a way of mapping discipline, if you will, based on the function of control and support. What the IIRP says is that there are different ways that you can do discipline, and sometimes you will do discipline which is high in control and low in support, which means that it will fall into the doing discipline to somebody or the punitive category, the red zone, if you will. If you do discipline that is low in control and low in support, then you are basically not disciplining. You're in kind of the neglectful zone is the way that the IARP would suggest. Okay, switching over to this side, you would do, if you do discipline that's low in control and high in support, you're in the for or the permissive category. What the IIRP suggests is that the sweet spot for discipline is high in control and high in support, in the green zone, so that you're doing discipline with the student or you're doing discipline restoratively. For this exercise, I want you to think about examples of situations that you may have seen in a classroom or in a family setting where a response to a child's behavior falls into each one of these categories. Let's take, for example, you're trying to teach a class and a student repeatedly, while you're lecturing, repeatedly gets up to sharpen his or her pencil. Child walks across the room to the pencil sharpener, and while you're trying to talk, okay? One way that you might be able to respond to that, which would be high in control and low in support, would be to discipline the child, do discipline to in like a punitive manner, might be send the kid down to the office, right? That would be one response, especially under zero tolerance, that you might fall to. The most neglectful might be ignoring and just continuing on. If you are high in support but low in control, then you might choose a response that would fall into the permissive category. You might do something for the child. You might, for example, stop your lecture to help the child sharpen their pencil. You might have a pencil available that you would stop your lecture, give the pencil to the child. That would fall into this yellow zone, this permissive zone. The ideal, according to the IIRP, and if you're doing justice restoratively, would be instead to be high in control and high in support and fall into this with category so that you work with the child to figure out, how can we resolve this? How can the child change their behavior at sharpening their pencil at an appropriate time, for example? How can you restore, or how can the child restore the harm that they've caused, or at least even understand that by sharpening the pencil, they're affecting their classmates in a way that, and you in a way that is troubling. There are 3 more scenarios that are typical situations that you might encounter in a classroom. I'd like you to work either by yourself, or if you're in a group right now, form a small group and work through examples, identifying examples for each of those scenarios that fall into each one of these categories. Remember, this is a judgment-free area. What we are hoping is that eventually your practice, your discipline practice, will grow into being high in control and high in support in the green zone. But for this exercise, for this segment of our training, simply look at the scenarios and figure out examples for each one of those scenarios that fall into each one of those categories. Now that we've worked through example number 1 together, I'd like you to choose example 2, 3, or 4 to work yourself or within a small group of 3 to 5 people to come up with examples of how a teacher might respond to any of those scenarios. I want to make sure that we're clear. There is no judgment in this exercise. What we are looking for right now, and you either yourself or within your group, we want to identify ways that a teacher might respond to a student in each one of these scenarios, 2, 3, and 4. We want an example that would fall into the punitive category. So a response that a teacher might have that is high in control and low in support. We want another example that falls into the neglectful category. It would be low in control and low in support. We also want an example for a way a teacher might respond, which is low in control and high in support, which would fall into the permissive category. And then also at least one example of how a teacher might respond that would be high in control and high in support, which lands them into the restorative or the green zone. Thank you. Have fun. Go ahead and pause the video on this slide or on the next slide, which gives you another picture of the social discipline window. The beauty of this exercise for me, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, is that it kind of takes the mystery out of discipline. What we can recognize when we look at discipline as a function of control and support is that we can always adjust our approach to how we deal with any particular situation. So if my natural tendency would be to be a permissive disciplinarian, it tells me that I can dial up my control And I can get into this green zone. I can get into a restorative approach fairly easily. If my natural tendency tends to be more punitive, or I do my discipline to students, I'm high in control and the support thing is not such an important thing to me, then it tells me I can dial up my support and get into the green zone again. And if I have to impose discipline where I have to send a child out of my classroom, perhaps they are horribly disruptive or they are causing the harm to themselves or to others, and they have to be removed. When that child comes back, if I take an approach which is more supportive, I can end up being, if not in the green zone, I can scooch right over to this right corner of the red zone still and continue to work toward a restorative solution. So the question that this exercise, I think, really begs for most educators is thinking about how you do discipline. Could you dial up control or dial down control and dial up support so that your discipline falls more into the green zone here that we're looking for, that's more restorative? Restorative justice is about relationships, and as we can see from the theories presented here, healthy relationships with students can help them choose to behave and to learn in ways that foster their success. Unlike traditional discipline, restorative discipline can help create and strengthen relationships after conflicts or misconduct. So how can you make restorative justice, restorative discipline work for you? Look for ways to heal the harm instead of going immediately to a punishment rubric. Listen to understand the stories of those affected by misconduct or conflict. Ask if those most affected have any ideas for how to make things right, and trust the wisdom of our shared human experience to facilitate students' success. Thank you on behalf of the WISD Restorative Justice Visioning Committee for joining us today to learn more about restorative justice and the reasons why it works. If you're interested in continuing to learn more about restorative justice or deepening your practice, we encourage you to visit the Restorative Justice webpage on the WISD website. You can go to the Community tab and scroll down and you'll see us there. Our Restorative Justice webpage features a number of resources, and we will be adding more in the days and weeks to come. I am so honored to be able to take this step with you in your restorative journey, and I can't wait to see how you use it to strengthen relationships along your way. Take care.